Hello, everyone. Thanks for showing up on this lovely Saturday. Many thanks to Maya Hoffman, Vasilis Oikonomopoulos, Martin Guinard, Flora Katz, and everyone else here at LUMA for bringing us together for this very promising symposium. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here and be able to share some ideas, questions, and curiosities with you. The research I will present today is less concerned with producing new knowledge than with curating different configurations of knowledge. It draws on the work of many other theorists and artists, some of whom I will mention during the talk. Also, I'm intending this presentation more as a prompt for thinking and discussion, rather than a series of fully formed arguments. So please bear with me if there are some gaps and loose ends here and there. And remember that your feedback will be actually very helpful for me. I want to begin by... Should I... How does this work? Okay. Also, if you could minimize my image to the corner of the screen, I think it's more important to see the pictures and read the words more easily. Thank you. I want to begin by addressing this notion of ethnofuturity as first and foremost concerned with distancing or reevaluating the distance from human status, from the subject of liberal humanism, whose shape keeps changing like lines drawn in sand on the beach of time, but only insofar as it maintains a degree of recognition or legibility that is required by the disciplines of the humanities. This quote from an essay by the Hong Kongese philosopher of technology, Yu Hui, is illuminating, I think. It encapsulates a particular critique of humanism from the perspective of the globalized experience of time, under the circumstances of capitalist modernity, or through the processes of what Hui refers to as modernization qua synchronization, which are necessary for maintaining the illusion or the hyper-reality of a unifying discourse of humanity. While I find the framing of modernity as both a problem and opportunity very helpful, I think we need to even further de-dramatize the end of humanism by posing that the apocalypse is not only an event on the horizon, but a structure already set in motion. The apocalypse is not only a matter of misunderstood teleology of the enlightened subject. Apocalypse has also been concurrent with humanity, often as a necessity for its development. To the humanist subject's much surprise, neither the end of history nor the end of the world are anything recent or forthcoming. What begs further questioning is this matter of whose history and which world we're talking about when we talk about an end, and what exactly how one ending here precipitates another beginning elsewhere. The infamous thesis of the end of history was a conviction about preventing the end of the world for humans. But once we consider all that is excluded from the human status as inseparable from the processes of worlding or world building, then we realize that the future, as a dynamic of both change and survival, needs to take into account the many ends already put to potential world histories. I'm wondering if and how ethnofuturity would serve as a vehicle for engaging with this haunting potentiality of another world history. But Hui is importantly making a point as well about the politics of time in the age of global capital. What is intended as chronopolitics is not an alternative or a rival to geopolitics, but something already at work within it. It's about temporal orders and time patterns that get embedded in or emerge from particular spatial configurations. The situatedness of historical narratives is not only about the particularity of events and characters, but also the kind of chronotopes that make a narrative possible. The term chronotope was coined by the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, who defined it as, quote, the intrinsic interconnectedness of the temporal and spatial relationships. It's about how space becomes charged with and responsive to the movements of time, end quote. But I think we need to push a bit further. and hold normative chronotopes responsible when they speak to how spaces get charged with not only movements, but the immobility of time as well. More specifically, one instance of chronopolitics as the management or distribution of temporal mobility was theorized already in the 80s by the anthropologist Johannes Fabian. He defined the politics of time in terms of the power relations that underlie how anthropology as a discipline requires a temporal gap or a denial of coevality between the expert and his subject of study. I mean, speaking of realities of science fiction, this one is one old example. Presumably, anthropologists don't only travel in space, but also in time. While where and when they travel to will remain stuck in a fixed space-time. Anthropologists move and encounter people and cultures from the past as if they're frozen in time or totally timeless, which makes it a necessary background for Western modernity to stage and realize itself as progressive. The notion of counterfutures then speaks to how the violent assumption of backwardness or timelessness persists in the developmental plans and policies of global capitalism, which we can also call science fiction or speculative fiction capitalism, following the late cultural critic Mark Fisher. He used that term in an essay from 2001, and I think 2 decades later, with the ascendance of finance capital and the centrality of speculation to global economy, the term is pretty much self-explanatory. Speculations over the future have been in circulation as an increasingly important commodity. It is against this background that Kojo Eshin, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with his work, writes about counterfutures in his further considerations of Afrofuturism. He writes, and I quote, "If global scenarios are speculative descriptions that are primarily concerned with making futures safe for the market, then Afrofuturism's first priority is to recognize that Africa increasingly exists as the object of futurist projection. African social reality is overdetermined by intimidating global scenarios and doomsday economic projections that predict decades of immiseration." End quote. So counterfutures, in fact, try to intervene with the normative chronotopes of the predictive and the projected, that in the name of the future are designed to preserve and extend the imbalances of the status quo, to keep Africa, among other places, as the zone of absolute dystopias and predatory futures. This is how a time out of joint transforms into a time that can never heal. The last pair of terms I wanted to turn to are facts of futurity, inspired by Arjun Appadurai, and fictions of ethnicity, inspired by Tavia Nyong'o, but I think I'll just leave them hanging there in the background, and maybe we'll come back to it in one way or another. As you might have gathered so far, neologism as a methodology is kind of important to this project. I think neologism speaks to that kind of practice which is more concerned with making new assemblages and constellations of knowledge rather than producing new content. And neologism is like montage or a remix. And I think there is a particular thesis about newness in every instance of neologism, because at best it can show that it is not about the new itself, but an orientation toward it. A neologism puts forth a meaning by retracing the course of its own coming into being. A neologism is like a compact archive in itself. It's like a time capsule. In this sense, I think there might be a methodological link between the generation of neologisms and tracing the trajectories of situated knowledges in space and time. But a neologism is also like a ready-made, a found object, even if you've made it yourself. There's always already so much stuffed in it. For example, not long after I thought of ethnofuturism as an umbrella term so naively for approaching an archive of different futurisms in the late 2017, I realized that the word already exists, and its history goes back to a group of young Estonian poets, but also painters and performers in the early 1990s, at the tail end of the Soviet era. They meant it as an aesthetic movement that would blend traditions from Finno-Ugric folklore and national romanticism with postmodernist principles. But there is more to say about this aesthetic movement and its seemingly harmless aspirations. Andreas Kreuger in Antwerp has done several curatorial projects with Estonian artists from the early generation of ethnofuturists there, including the painter Ismail Efimov, whose work you see on the right, a painter that transitioned from a very successful career as a socialist realist to a performer on paper, a syncretic style that awkwardly falls between figuration and abstraction, both summoning spirits and functioning as icons in and of themselves. But there's also something schizoid, I think, and somehow disintegrating about these icons or spirits. The performance on paper seems to remain ongoing, and the spirit or icon remains in the midst of becoming. Holding divergent forms of figuration, abstraction, and animism together without subordinating one to the other, Efimov's art neither fully participates in nor exactly refuses the Estonian tradition of ethnofuturism, which, as Kreuger identifies it, often slipped into, quote, a New Age-inspired and ultimately apolitical vision of spiritual positivity, end quote. The crucial point in this respect, though, is that their discourse has actually taken many turns since then, so much so that it is now pretty much hijacked by a growing right-wing ethno-nationalist discourse in Estonia. The book you see in the middle is a manifestation of this turn. What its authors mean by the rebirth of Europe is a xenophobic and anti-globalist ideology that aims, and I quote, to ensure that liberalism dies at the hands of indigenous Europeans, not Islamic invaders, end quote. All of this is, of course, part of the most recent tide of copycat populisms in the US, UK, Europe, and South Asia. But in fact, it's been neoliberalism that's been quite efficient in realizing that postmodern dream of a blend between the past and the future. The anthropologist duo John and Jean Komarov have written about this in their study of the commodification of Zulu identity in South Africa. They ask, and I quote, could it be contra to much of social science orthodoxy, and that one possible future, perhaps the future of ethnicity, lies metaphorically and materially alike in ethnofutures, in taking it into the marketplace, in hitching it overtly to the world of franchising and finance capital, investing it in an identity economy? Well, I think these are rhetorical questions. The answer is pretty much yes. But I also think that this needs to be, well, not taken for granted or simply reconciled with. An affirmative approach toward the forces of capital doesn't have to entirely foreclose the prospects of a post-capitalist world. A critical navigation of ethnofuturity perhaps requires a constant push and pull between the global capitalist and the fanatic tribalist treatments of it. Before briefly discussing a few examples of ethnofuturisms, I want to mention my previous attempt at bringing some of them together in an edited volume that came out through Merve Verlag in Germany in mid-2018. I think this meme can metaphorically explain how I approached the book project, which is, I think, already from a few lifetimes ago. It seemed like a book that a superhero with white male savior complex would have mistaken for an actually existing philosophy of time travel around the world and across its different time scales of becoming. I will never forget one of the first comments that a friend gave me on this book while it was still in the making. He said, well, great stuff, but you don't want to end up with a 50 Shades of Brown futurism sort of thing, do you? Well, I'm honestly not sure whether I do or don't. I mean, 50 Shades of Brown futurism doesn't sound too bad. Or does it? But in parallel to the principles of representation or inclusivity, which are important, don't get me wrong, the crucial issue with a project like this is allegorized, in this self-made meme at least, by the glasses. In other words, in order for us to see the project of ethnofuturity as part of a potential philosophy of time travel, we need a conceptual device or a critical lens that can relieve the reality effects of optical illusions. For example, the illusion that separates science fiction from social reality, as Donna Haraway famously put it. With this in mind, I'd like to turn to only two projects in the context of ethnofuturity. Sinofuturism 1839 to 2046 AD is a video essay by the London-based artist and game designer Lawrence Leck, which explores parallels between portrayals of artificial intelligence and Chinese technological development. Leck combines elements of science fiction, documentary, social realism, and Chinese cosmology in order to delve into the social and cultural dilemmas of China and the people of its diaspora. In the film, the computerized voice of a text-to-speech narrator declares that, and I quote, "Sinofuturism is an invisible movement, a specter already embedded into a trillion industrial products, a billion individuals, and a million veiled narratives. It is a movement not based on individuals, but on multiple overlapping flows of populations, products, and processes. Because Sinofuturism has arisen without conscious intention or authorship, it is often mistaken for contemporary China. But it is not. It is a science fiction that already exists." End quote. Such fiction of a mutated collectivity is further clarified by Leck in an interview where he says that the robot, in the sense of an agential being sans the liberal humanist exceptionalism, is for Afrofuturism what artificial intelligence is for Sinofuturism, pointing toward the diffused infrastructures of neural networks that surpass the figural vocabulary of much humanoid imaginaries. China, as a geopolitical entity whose global representations incorporate its people as metonyms and allegories, is represented as a sentient and submissive being in itself that can get trained for various tasks exceeding the alleged capacities of the human. That is the subject of liberal humanism. In other words, the Sinofuturist imaginary both underlines and undermines the centrality of the liberal humanist subject to the invention and development of historical time. But Sinofuturism is ambivalent in whether it roots for a relaunch of sociopolitical, cultural, and economic dominion from another side of the world, akin to a certain sense of supremacist transhumanism, or toward a certain mode of subaltern posthumanism that is cognizant of the ways in which humanism and its concurrent processes of becoming alien repeatedly get re-territorialized under various crypto-expansionist circumstances. But what fascinates me about Leck's approach to this phenomenon, which he also pursues in two animated films that serve as sequels to this video essay, is how he is trying to both internalize and invert the techno-orientalist narrative of China. We can extrapolate from Leck's vision of ethnofuturity a certain suggestion that it is right within alienating portrayals and reductive representations that those subjected to decades and centuries of imperial violence can find a point of radical convergence, recognizing what's been inflicted upon them as a common ground for reorganizing their agency. By embracing 7 key stereotypes of Chinese society: computing, copying, gaming, studying, addiction, labor, and gambling, and pushing them to their logical limits, Sinofuturism, the film, asks how exotic imaginaries, for instance, can open up a shared space for challenging the power dynamics of othering from within. Next one, please. The other work I want to briefly discuss is a short sci-fi film from 2019 by the London-based Palestinian artist Larissa Sansour in collaboration with Soren Lind. The film is set in a post-apocalyptic Bethlehem, a few decades after the city was swept over by a devastating environmental disaster. A mother on her deathbed and a clone of her dead daughter are debating the past and the future in an underground bunker, the only kind of space where life can go on in the post-apocalyptic Palestine. The cloned daughter never got to gain her own lived experience of the world before the catastrophe, but the memories of her ancestors are implanted in her engineered psyche. The mother, and who is simultaneously less and more than her daughter, are arguing over reference points for their identities. They are both living through the trauma, but with varying degrees of attachment to it and its sources. The daughter complains over the symbols and fictions that have filled up her head and shaped her knowledge of a world she has never experienced and never will either. And the mother is replying with stories of how entire worlds and nations were born out of fairy tales and fictions, out of an orchestrated repetition and engineered reproduction of certain imageries and imaginaries, without much basis in anyone's actual lived experience. Scenes of their conversation in the underground bunker cut through with flashbacks to life before the catastrophe and older archival footage of Bethlehem. In shots of the eco-disaster itself, we see a thick rush of black liquid coursing through the city's streets, an image that evokes both classic post-apocalyptic tropes, while also calling to mind specific environmental catastrophes that actually took place, like the Gulf War oil spill in the early 90s. The film uses sci-fi to raise important questions about diasporic identities and futures in both a Palestinian and a global context. How do past traumas shape our sense of self and community? What do we do with memories of a place that no longer exists? How can we live out of an image or a symbol? How does an entire nation state live out of an image or a symbol? What other modes of belonging might we create in the face of colonial and climate catastrophe? I also think the way that the film ties settler colonialism to both ethnic cleansing and climate catastrophes points to an important potential of speculative futurism for narrating today's realities. Here and there in the film, a fascination with the preservation of native plants pops up. An orchard of native Palestinian plants grows within the safety of the bunker, cultivated from heirloom seeds preserved from the catastrophe. Mixing shots of the underground orchard with flashbacks of the mother and her then alive and younger daughter harvesting olives outside of Bethlehem, which is, by the way, a landscape that has currently been made inaccessible to Palestinians because of Israeli settlements. In vitro, the film underscores the importance of land and indigenous agriculture as an enduring element of cultural heritage. Can we go to the last slide? Yes, thank you. I want to end with a very schematic proposition. It concerns a re-evaluation of the frames of comparison between different futurisms. The diagram on the right is a major point of reference in the early history of ethnofuturism in Estonia, when some prominent and powerful Estonian intellectuals started promoting ideas of the literary movement as a suitable ideology for people who were seeking to productively reconcile cultural identity and societal progress around the turn of the century. The political scientist and former politician Rein Taagepera, who also wrote about the Finno-Ugrian minorities in Russia, elaborated the ethnofuturist triangle by adding two neologisms of his own: cosmofuturism, oriented toward a smooth future free of race and ethnicity, and ethnopraetorism, which posited that the ethnic past is pure and shouldn't be mixed with alien phenomena. I think the idea of a middle ground, which was the aim of early ethnofuturism, in terms of a double-pronged peace treaty or modus vivendi, is pretty much clear from this triangle. But this model considers the different remediations of the past and the future as separate ideologies, as different and even rival camps of ideas. Also, given what neoliberalism has done to that poetic middle ground, ethnofuturism is constantly caught on the verge of collapse into either the capitalist or the tribalist ends of the spectrum. So we need another model to map these tendencies. I think we need a more layered or a scalar model to think about futurist tendencies. What I'm suggesting for a project or discipline of comparative futurism is a methodology where not only different ethnofuturisms can be compared with one another, but also that a tertiary differential is considered to be at work within one or another so-called ethnofuturist world. I think such a differential allows to register how futurisms find their ways around the ends of history by pushing against the framework that simply pits processes of identification against modes of alienation, instead of considering them as folded and nested within one another. And for this, we need to think outside the box of humanist or anthropic identities. This can help with thinking about how chronotopes gain and lose their charge as they move between different planetary configurations, maybe similar to how electrons move up or fall down the scales of energy around the nucleus of an atom. And then I wonder if we could take some clues from those fixed units of energy that are the basis for mobility across different scales and conceptualize something in terms of temporal commons. My question basically is how to conceptualize the commons, the basis of commonality in terms of time and across various time scales. Maybe for this we need a critical theory of futurity that can reorient the memories and fears of ethnocide on the one hand, and attractions to the actually existing modes of cosmopolitanism on the other, toward a political reckoning with xenogenesis, with the material rhythms and temporalities of becoming alien. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahan, for this talk. We have a bit of time for questions, which we'll address from the audience. But maybe what I would like to ask you for a start is you finish your conversation with this very important, I think, sets of notion where you oppose, you put three polarity. There's the xeno, which is like being afraid of futures that comes from pretty much creating a sort of nationalism that can project itself into the space. And then you have the cosmo and the ethno. And it's a very important, I mean, in through your work and through the people that you've been working with, Kojo and all these people, it's pretty important that there is, that there is a sort of decolonization of the imaginary, because they've been imagined, it's been quoted a lot through white males' imaginary, so that's a pretty important part. And ethnofuturism for you is a way of trying to help, if I understand well, this decolonization of the imaginary. But do you think that you could run a risk of further essentializing and therefore, counter the very aim that you have through this form of ethno literature, let's say?
Okay, a couple of things. What I mean by xeno in that framework is quite contrary to that fearful vision of the future. In fact, in that constellation, I think it's either the ethno or the cosmo poles that get fixed and reterritorialized, like cosmo as in the cosmos of global capitalism, and ethno as in ethno-nationalism. And xeno seems to be, this foreign aspect seems to be exactly the way out sometimes of this either or. And of course, I'm taking xenogenesis from the work of the African-American science fiction writer Octavia Butler. It's the title of a trilogy that she completed in '89, I think. And to just briefly retell the story, xenogenesis is the process through which humans end up surviving a catastrophe, but by mating with aliens. So humans finally understand they have to compromise their humanity if there is going to be anything left of humanity. So it's that opening, actually, that imagines a future that is not so fixed. I'm really taking it from there. But on the other hand, as I told you in our previous conversations, ethnofuturism is a risky task.
Can you develop on that? What's the risk, according to you?
Well, the risk could very much be essentialization on the one hand, but also branding purely, as in the quote by the Komarovs. Like, why are we creating ethnofuturisms, I think, defines the way that we approach the risk. Like, is it for having an enterprise, like, similar to things that Sophia was complaining about? Is it just yet another sexy thing? Although I don't think sexy things are bad necessarily. It's I think about how you approach them. But I think the aim of creating these visions or neologisms is more important than what they, might run the risk of. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's quite beautiful actually. You made it's just like I got because you were talking about these Hungarian narratives that were were some kind of very nationalist imaginaries were kind of trying to grasp what the future should look like and how this kind of pretty much like there is a very notion of hermetic self that projects itself through an inheritance from the past, and therefore, like a sort of very ethnic, but in a very negative sense, in this context of nationalism. So that's why, the Xeno here has that tendency too. I mean, it's
Totally. That reminds me actually of this very new initiative in Budapest, between Budapest and Berlin, by an independent publishing collective called Technologie und Heimlich. And they are promoting this idea of Hungarofuturism. And what they're promoting is exactly not, they call it a post-Hungarian movement that embraces xeno-aesthetics. And by that they mean that our ethnic heritage, our ethnic history has already been totally hijacked and claimed by the ethno-nationalist state and government, the ruling ideology. So for us to actually claim being Hungarian, we need to alienate ourselves from what has been established as Hungarianness. There needs to be a degree of defamiliarization in order to both retain, reclaim the ethnic identity, but also push through those pitfalls of essentialization, of hermeticism, of a closed-off society.
That's a very beautiful way to go, I think, and it resonates a lot. Actually, we have the luck of having Jonas Stahl with us, who's written on topic like that, on how to establish comradeships with inclusion of species that would be, let's say, alien, or like trying to reimagine what it means to create those commons. I want to ask if there's maybe questions in the audience. Are there any questions for que les gens veulent poser? Jonas, tu veux faire un...
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I understood from the beginning of your talk the notion of progress as something inherently tied to apocalypse, and your counter proposition as one that is about navigating time scales in the sense of undoing our ties to linear time. And I was wondering how that relates to the Aboriginal concept of the dreaming with capital D, not the dreaming as escape or processing, but the dreaming as a space where ancestors and descendants coexist across different scales of time, and what that says about, could we understand your proposition as one that proposes an equality of times, or an equality of time scales and mutual presences in which the artworks that you propose operate as a kind of gateways or time seeds that do not, that break with this idea of frozen time that you spoke about earlier, but actually shows this equality of time scales as an equality of living worlds across another chronopolitical paradigm.
That's a great question. What I hesitate in terms of considering these different time scales as equal or equally accessible is exactly because dreams have been capitalized as well. So that alternate space of dreaming that can immediately summon a time different from the present is under pressure from different sides. So yes, these different times we could conclude that they coexist together, but accessing them is not always a matter of choice, or even a matter of going back to ancient instruments that used to do the work before, because, well, the world has changed, simply. So that's why I think politics is really important. and to not just be like, oh, science fiction, yes, we can go back and forth in time, great. Like, no, we can't. Like, there are venues for it, but there are guards that control your movement across it. So maybe a negotiation as well is needed, as well as just technological development. Does that answer your question?
Well, that's a very beautiful way of putting it. We have time for another question. On peut poser des questions en français aussi, bien sûr, si c'est.
You can ask your questions in either French or English.
The opportunity, because we have like 3 more minutes, but Sophia, in her video, like she was talking about how this notion of, she prefers the speculative fiction as a tool. We made it today about science fiction, but you talked more about forms of futurism. Could you tell us more, like how futurism is a more important tool for you, and that actually exactly connects to what we just discussed?
I personally came to science fiction through futurism. I was not one of those teenagers that grew up reading science fiction. I did not.
How would you differentiate them?
Simply in my life experience. It was not through a love for science fiction, it was through a fear of the future and not knowing what it holds for me or what's going to happen. But once you delve into it, you see that, oh, there's a wealth of literature there. And also I have to say that maybe if I was in the sciences and not the humanities, I would not have taken this futurism's path, because there really isn't that much of space in the humanities to include critical studies of science fiction. It's only happening now because it's so speculative and so often ungrounded, or seems to be ungrounded from something material, something somewhere in the world that you can put a circle around, that it's difficult to even bring it into academia. So maybe now that I'm thinking, futurism could be a link between the science fictional world and the world of the humanities. I mean, with hopes that one would conquer the other, of course.
Well, that's a very beautiful way of ending this discussion. Again, thank you so much, Mahan, for this beautiful talk about
Thank you.
futurism.